Wait to see how a man's silence can be the deadliest weapon in the hands of those who crave absolute control. Don't miss the detailed anatomy of a manipulation that spans millennia, revealing how Jezebel's shadows are still cast over the tables of modern homes. Stay tuned to understand why the danger lies not in the shout, but in the whisper that destroys what you love most. Your perception of spiritual protection will change today. The son of Samaria was unable to warm the cold emanating from the ivory walls of the royal palace, where King Ahab, heir to a lineage of conquerors, now cowered like a wounded child before the refusal of a simple peasant named Naboth. The dust suspended in the shafts of light piercing the window slits seemed frozen in time, witnessing the exact moment a sovereign's whim collided with the integrity of a man who valued his heritage more than his own life. It was not merely a dispute over land or a verdant vineyard touching the palace walls. It was the beginning of an invisible fissure in a nation's soul. Here, the omission of the one meant to lead opened the necessary space for darkness to settle under the name of a queen. For many years, order in Israel was maintained by fear and power, but on that late afternoon, the pattern of authority shattered when Ahab turned his face to the wall, refusing to eat, allowing the smell of cold food to mingle with the stench of his own cowardice. The man who commanded armies and cities slept in an artificial peace, unaware that his silence was about to invite a nightmare that would not only seize Naboth's vineyard, but devour the very essence of his own house. Jezebel's presence at the threshold did not bring the sound of heavy footsteps, but the subtle rustle of expensive fabrics against the rough stone floor, a nearly imperceptible sound that carried the weight of an unshakable will. Her nails, slightly stained with the remnants of rituals the people preferred to ignore, contrasted with her pale skin and eyes that sought not comfort, but weakness to fill with her own agenda. She did not ask about her husband's pain with the empathy of a companion. She observed the curve of his back with the precision of a predator, identifying the exact point where the armor is breached. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the scent of foreign incense and the cold sweat of a king who, by abdicating his voice, handed the scepter to the hands of one who would turn manipulation into a macabre science. The mystery now unfolding is not how Naboth died, but how a man chosen to rule became the voluntary host for a force that would use his name to sign death warrants while he remained in complicit silence. Naboth's refusal to sell his father's inheritance was not an act of political rebellion, but a visceral fidelity to the roots that sustained his existence, something Ahab's distorted mind, accustomed to buying loyalties with gold coins, could never fully process. The king of Israel, surrounded by luxuries that hid the poverty of his spirit, saw in that vineyard only a vegetable garden. For the peasant, however, every vine was a testament to a covenant with the Creator, a sacred connection that no royal decree had the power to break or profane. By lying on his bed and covering his face, Ahab was not just pouting over a denied whim. He was signaling to the entire spiritual realm that his authority was vacant, creating a dangerous vacuum that the psychology of manipulation fills with terrifying speed. This bitter silence from the man meant to protect justice is, in truth, the fertile soil where Jezebel's narcissism planted its first seeds of destruction. She used her husband's victimhood as a moral justification for the cruelty she already planned to execute in the name of a false family protection. We often believe evil enters our homes through great explosions of violence, but the historical reality of Samaria reveals it prefers to enter through the sigh of one who feels wronged by life and decides the world owes them something, regardless of the price others must pay. Jezebel's shadow, projected against the limestone wall, was not just the silhouette of a woman, but the representation of a control system that feeds on the passivity of others to build empires over the graves of the innocent. She approached the bed with a spine-chilling calm, not to console Ahab's wounded ego, but to test how far the elasticity of his conscience would allow her to go. She used words that sounded like honey, but carried the bitterness of gall in their hidden essence. "Do you not now govern Israel?" was the question that functioned as a psychological trigger, transforming the responsibility of royal service into a privilege of selfish domination. It distorted Ahab's identity, so he saw himself as Naboth's victim rather than the guardian of the law. The sweat dripping from the king's temples was the physical sign of an internal struggle he had already lost. By accepting that his wife would solve the problem, he wasn't just outsourcing a task, he was surrendering his soul to be molded by a will that knew no limits or mercy. The real danger we face today is no different from what haunted those ivory corridors. It lies in our willingness to close our eyes to the means others use to give us what we want, as long as our hands remain seemingly clean while Naboth's blood begins to stain the sacred earth. Jezebel did not need swords to conquer the vineyard. She understood that the bureaucracy of evil is far more efficient than brute force when one wishes to destroy a righteous man's reputation before taking his body. She sat at the dark oak table, torchlight casting shadows that danced like demons on the walls, and began writing letters in Ahab's name, sealing each parchment with the royal ring the king had surrendered in his cowardly passivity. The cold metal of the seal against the hot wax was the sound of a death sentence being forged in the silence of the palace, a manipulation that used Israel's own religious and civil structure to give a veneer of legality to what was, in essence, a spiritual and physical murder. She ordered a fast, summoning the city's elders to a ceremony that was supposed to exude holiness but carried the foul odor of hypocrisy. It proved that the spirit of manipulation loves to clothe itself in the robes of piety to hide its sharp claws. Naboth, the man whose nails were dirty with the soil he loved so much, did not know that the banquet offered in his honor was, in fact, the scaffold where his integrity would be sacrificed on the altar of a foreign queen's narcissistic desire. Jezebel's strategy involved hiring sons of Belial, individuals whose souls were already seared and who would sell their testimony for a few coins, creating a false narrative accusing Naboth of blaspheming God and the king. This is the science of manipulation in its purest state. It does not just attack possession, it attacks the source of honor, isolating the victim in a web of lies that turns the community against the one who was always faithful. While the letters traveled through the night, Ahab remained in his room, feigning an ignorance that made him an accomplice to every drop of blood about to be shed. He knew Jezebel's way involved breaking every law he had sworn to protect. The weight of a leader's silence is what allows the poison of manipulation to circulate through society's veins, turning neighbors into executioners and transforming justice into a tool of oppression that leaves no visible traces for the unwary eye. The archaeological mystery of this pain lies not in the stones of Jezreel, but in the ease with which a manipulative woman's voice can silence the conscience of an entire council of elders through fear and political favoritism. The day of the fast in Jezreel did not dawn with the purity of repentance, but with a heavy, dry air that made the elders' throats burn under the relentless Galilean sun. Naboth was led to the place of honor, his hands calloused from working the earth, resting on robes he was unaccustomed to wearing. He failed to see that the glint in the eyes of the men sitting before him was the reflection of silver coins, not brotherly respect. The silence preceding the accusation was so thick one could hear the buzz of flies over the exposed fruit, an organic prelude to the moral rot about to be revealed by witnesses bought with the blood of integrity. When the two sons of Belial stood up, their voices did not tremble as they uttered the lie planned in the ivory corridors. They understood that in this system of manipulation, Truth was a luxury no peasant could sustain against a king's seal. Jezebel's narcissistic psychology operated here through triangulation, using third parties to strike the blow while she remained in the shadows, watching as fear transformed an entire community into silent accomplices of a judicial lynching. The stones of Jezreel, rough and cold despite the day's heat, became the instruments of a distorted justice that sought to forever silence the man who dared to say no to absolute power. Every blow that struck Naboth's body echoed as a warning to anyone who still believed a father's heritage was more sacred than the whim of those who hold a profane crown. The blood trickling into the cracks of the dry earth was not just the end of a life, but biological proof that Ahab's passivity had turned into a lethal weapon, allowing his wife's foreign poison to redraw the geography of justice in Israel. As Naboth's body was left behind, news of the solution traveled back to the palace like a foul wind, bringing immediate relief to a king who preferred the comfort of possession over the weight of righteousness. The science of manipulation celebrates its victory when the victim is eliminated and the manipulated feels they have received a gift, ignoring that the price of this favor is the permanent destruction of their own character and the start of a curse that no vineyard can ever compensate. News of Naboth's death reached Ahab's ears not as a funeral dirge, but as a whispered invitation from Jezebel for him to finally take possession of what his cowardice had not dared to conquer alone. The king, who previously huddled against the wall in a manipulated depression, rose with a somber agility, shaking the dust from his royal robes while the smell of food, now accepted, mingled with the metallic scent of betrayal hanging in the palace air. He did not ask for the trial's details, nor did he care which stones had silenced the peasant's voice. The science of manipulation teaches that the beneficiary must maintain a hygienic distance from the crime to preserve the illusion of their own innocence. As he prepared his chariot to go down to the vineyard in Jezreel, the grinding of iron wheels against the stony ground sounded like a distant echo of a righteous man's broken bones. A macabre melody Ahab chose to ignore in exchange for the immediate pleasure of expanding his gardens. Christian psychology reveals that Ahab's sin was not just omission, but the silent celebration of a result he knew was the fruit of deep injustice, making his hands just as red as his wife's. Upon entering Naboth's vineyard, Ahab felt the sun of Jezreel burn his neck, but the coolness of the vines seemed to offer a lying consolation to a conscience he believed he had put to sleep under Jezebel's seal. He walked among the rows of grapes, touching the leaves that still carried the care of hands now cold under a pile of stones. For a brief moment, the satisfaction of possession filled the vacuum of his abdicated authority. However, the ground he walked upon was not just soil. It was a living archive of a cry rising to the heavens. The Bible teaches that the earth does not forget the blood of the innocent, and that no ivory wall is high enough to muffle the voice of divine justice. The central thesis of this fall lies in the fact that Ahab believed he had gained a garden, when in reality, he had just inherited a cemetery for his own dynasty. It proves that everything manipulation delivers comes with a spiritual mortgage that will be collected with interest in destruction. He did not yet know it, but as he admired another man's fruit, a shadow far older and severer than Jezebel's was about to cross his path, bringing the reckoning that no king can avoid. If Ahab's silence is finding a place of reflection within you, or if you have felt the weight of a manipulation that offered a gift but stole your peace, leave your sign of support and join us on this healing journey. Comment below the phrase, "My healing has begun," as a seal of commitment to your truth and God's justice over your home. Ahab walked among Naboth's vines, smelling the sweet scent of grapes ripening under the Jezreel sun, ignoring that every step on that land was a profanation of an ancestral covenant. The king's satisfaction was a thick fog, preventing his eyes from seeing the silhouette forming at the vineyard entrance. A man whose camel hair garments and fiery gaze contrasted violently with the monarch's fine linen and relaxed posture. Elijah brought no armies, but his presence carried the weight of an authority that made the ivory palace look like a straw hut about to collapse before a desert wind. Upon seeing the prophet, the king felt a sudden chill in his bones that no royal tunic could warm. He instantly recognized the mirror that would reveal the rot hidden beneath his crown. The psychology of guilt teaches us that when confronted with truth, the manipulated often attacks the messenger to avoid the horror of looking at their own reflection in the blood of the innocent. "Have you found me, O my enemy?" was the defensive cry of a man who knew his peace was a fragile construction made of lies and complicit silences. Elijah's response was not a theological debate, but a spiritual autopsy that exposed the raw nerve of Ahab's betrayal against his own people and the God who had established him. "I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord," the prophet said, using words that cut through the atmosphere like polished bronze blades. At that moment, the vineyard ceased to be a trophy of possession and became the courtroom where the sentence of Ahab's house would be read aloud, echoing through the hills of Israel like thunder announcing a storm. The hidden why of that tragedy was finally revealed. It was not just about land, but about the sale of a soul for a piece of momentary pleasure engineered by a narcissistic mind. Ahab, who thought he had cheated history by using Jezebel's seal, discovered that the Creator does not just read official scrolls. He hears the cry of the stones used to crush Naboth. The danger of allowing the spirit of manipulation to rule your house is that eventually you will have to face the truth in a place where there is nowhere left to hide. Elijah's voice was more than a sound. It was a physical force that seemed to dismantle the layers of silk and pride covering Ahab's body, revealing the spiritual nakedness of a man who traded his birthright for a vegetable patch. Upon hearing the sentence, that his blood would be licked by dogs in the very place where Naboth's blood dried under the sun, the king did not react with a warrior's fury, but with the collapse of a sandcastle hit by the tide. He tore his royal robes, those Jezebel so admired as symbols of power she herself manipulated, and put on the rough sackcloth of penance. He felt the coarse texture against skin that previously only knew the touch of ivory and fine linen. Christian psychology shows us that in a moment of profound shock, even a mind seared by manipulation can experience a flash of reality, a chill in the bones that comes not from the desert, but from the fear of eternal judgment. Ahab began to walk slowly, head bowed, not as a sovereign inspecting his lands, but as a prisoner counting his final steps before execution. It proved that the pleasure of possession is an illusion that evaporates the instant truth knocks at the door. The why of this humiliation was not just fear of punishment, but the late recognition that he had become a stranger in his own house, a guest to a foreign will that had turned him into a monster. This slow, silent walk through the palace corridors was the antithesis of the noise of Jezebel's feasts. It was the sound of the emotional vacuum that settles when we realize we were the architects of our own ruin. While the king fasted and lay in sackcloth, the silence in Samaria became as heavy as the stones that killed the peasant, creating an atmosphere of tension where every shadow seemed to carry Elijah's gaze. The Bible teaches that God, in his infinite mercy, observed this change in posture and said to the prophet, "Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me?" However, Ahab's tragedy is that his humiliation was a gasp for survival, not a change of alliance. He continued under the same roof as the woman who had sold him to sin, keeping the structure of manipulation intact while trying to negotiate with the divine sentence. The danger of a superficial cure is that it relieves the immediate pain but does not remove the tumor of narcissistic influence that continues to drain the soul's life in the shadows of daily existence. We are often heirs to this same pattern. We weep over the consequences but hesitate to destroy the altar of manipulation that promised us what it never had the right to give. Ahab's silence in his sackcloth was not just an act of contrition, but a temporary refuge against the storm his wife continued to fuel behind the scenes of power. Jezebel, observing her husband's humiliation, felt no compassion, but a frigid contempt that she skillfully transformed into a new form of control, waiting for the king's fear to give way to the weariness of penance. The psychology of spiritual narcissism teaches us that the manipulator never allows their victim to heal completely, for a restored soul is one that can no longer be governed by fear or guilt. She walked through the courtyards where the dust of centuries settled on the statues of foreign gods, planning how to reassert her influence over a man who, though he wept before the Creator, still slept under the roof of seduction. The hidden why of this dynamic lies in Jezebel's need to keep Ahab in a state of emotional dependency, where he feels incapable of making decisions without the practical and implacable way she offers. It is the science of manipulation, acting like a spider's web. The more the victim struggles to be free, the more the invisible threads of comfort and habit bind them to the center of another's will. While the king dragged himself through his sorrow, the queen remained as a sentinel of darkness, observing the textures of the sweaty skin and the sunken eyes of a man who had traded his dignity for a security made of glass. She did not confront him with shouts, but with a silence laden with the expectation that the fruit of doubt would ripen in her companion's heart. She whispered through small gestures that life could return to normal if he would just stop listening to the voices of the desert. The danger of a house divided between a prophet's truth and a manipulator's lie is that the atmosphere becomes unbreathable, a battlefield where every meal is a test of loyalty and every glance is a trap. The Bible shows us that Jezebel's presence was like invisible mold on the ivory walls, something that cannot be cleaned with tears alone, but requires the total destruction of the structure that allowed it entry. Ahab, however, preferred the warmth of the ashes to the risk of confronting the woman who had made him a king of appearances, keeping alive the flame of a destruction he himself had sworn to abandon. The mystery of this fall lies not in the woman's strength, but in the abdication of the man who chose to be a passenger in his own destiny, allowing the hand that caressed him to be the same one writing his definitive sentence. Time passed over the hills of Samaria, like a river hiding sharp stones beneath calm waters, and Ahab's humiliation, once so vivid, began to dissipate under the routine of banquets and political decisions that Jezebel skillfully orchestrated. The psychology of manipulation is grounded in the erosion of spiritual memory. It works so that the shock of judgment is replaced by the comfort of nothing has happened yet, making the manipulated feel that Elijah's words were just the delusions of a bitter prophet. The king now walked through Naboth's vineyard, which had already been integrated into the royal gardens, feeling the sun warm his skin and believing that somehow he had negotiated with fate and won. The grape he picked and brought to his mouth no longer tasted of the blood he had felt at first, but of the dangerous sweetness of impunity, an intoxicant that the science of manipulation uses to keep consciences seared while the abyss opens right ahead. It is the cursed success syndrome, where every new conquest seems to validate the previous crime, ignoring that divine justice is not slow but precise, awaiting the exact moment when the fruit of iniquity is ripe for harvest. Jezebel watched her husband resume his sovereign posture with a discreet smile, knowing her victory lay not in the possession of the land, but in reclaiming Ahab's mind for her own sphere of influence. She no longer needed to whisper orders. The king now acted by instinct, following the tracks she had laid with such patience and cruelty. It proved that the most effective spiritual control is that which makes the victim believe they are exercising their own will. The danger of getting used to a blessing born of a curse is that the individual loses the ability to distinguish between God's providence and the adversary's trap. The atmosphere in the palace was one of artificial peace, a glass bubble where the laughter of guests drowned out the cries of Naboth's orphans, and where the smoke of pagan altars rose as a continuous affront to the heavens. We often find ourselves in this same place, confusing the absence of immediate consequences with divine approval, unaware that God's silence can be the prelude to a storm that no ivory structure can withstand. The mystery of this block lies not in the sin itself, but in the terrifying ease with which humans adapt to evil when it is served on golden plates. 3 years of deceptive peace passed, and Israel's soil seemed to have absorbed Naboth's blood without leaving visible scars on the surface. But the geography of Ahab's heart was about to be tested by a new wave of greed. Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, came down to visit Samaria in a display of diplomacy that hid the dangers of an unequal union, where light attempted to sit at the table with the shadows cast by Jezebel's spirit. During the banquet, amidst the glint of silver cups and the aroma of roasted meats, Ahab cast the hook of manipulation over his guest, questioning why Ramoth-Gilead had not yet been retaken from the Syrians. The psychology of manipulation often uses a just cause to drag others into a shared destruction, and Ahab, a master at outsourcing risks, sought to validate his own ambition through Jehoshaphat's apparent righteousness. Jezebel did not need to be in the room. Her influence was present in how Ahab seduced the king of Judah with promises of glory, proving that the poison of control becomes more dangerous when distilled through a strategic friendship. The ivory palace pulsed with the sound of music, but the air grew thin as the decision for war was sealed with a handshake that ignored the silent warnings of divine prudence. Ahab felt invincible, believing that the presence of a God-fearing king by his side would serve as an amulet against the judgment Elijah had prophesied years before. This is the science of manipulation in its expansion phase. It seeks accomplices with good reputations to cover its own moral nakedness, creating a facade of unity that hides purely selfish intentions. Jehoshaphat, though a man of faith, allowed the atmosphere of hospitality and Ahab's distorted charisma to cloud his discernment, agreeing to participate in a journey that was not born at the altar, but in the insatiable desire of a couple who knew no meaning of enough. The danger of associating with the spirit of Jezebel is that it never walks alone. It always demands you put your own life at stake to protect the interests of those who would never sacrifice themselves for you. The courtyard of Samaria turned into a stage of spiritual frenzy, where 400 men dressed in prophetic mantles but fed by Jezebel's table danced and shouted promises of victory for the two kings sitting on their thrones. Zedekiah, the leader of that performance, brandished iron horns to symbolize Ahab's strength, creating a visual choreography intended to bury any doubt with the weight of repetition and collective enthusiasm. The psychology of mass manipulation uses noise and social validation to silence divine intuition. If everyone is shouting "go," it becomes almost impossible for the average mind to hear the whisper of "stop." Jehoshaphat, however, felt the shiver of distrust beneath his royal tunic, realizing that this orchestra of flattery was conducted by a spirit that sought not the Creator's will, but the manipulator's approval. The why behind so many prophets agreeing with each other was not unity in the spirit, but slavery to a system that rewarded lies and punished integrity with ostracism or death. Jehoshaphat's insistence on a prophet of the Lord forced Ahab to reveal his last shred of brutal honesty: the existence of Micaiah, the man he hated because he never prophesied what the royal ego desired to hear. The science of manipulation detests contradiction, for truth acts as a forensic light, revealing bloodstains and fingerprints of betrayal at the crime scene. Micaiah was brought from the shadows of prison, his body bearing the marks of confinement, but his eyes preserved the brightness of one who had not sold himself for a seat at Jezebel's banquet. Entering the courtyard, he saw not kings but naked souls before judgment, and his physical presence was a silent affront to the ivory luxury surrounding him. The danger of having a Micaiah nearby is that he breaks the spell of manipulation with a single sentence, reminding the manipulated that the majority consensus has no power to alter eternity's verdict. Ahab trembled, for he knew the theater was about to fall, and that this time no seal or lie could protect him from what was coming. Micaiah did not limit himself to earthly words. He tore the veil of visible reality to expose the spiritual engineering that was leading Ahab to his final ruin. He described the Lord sitting on his throne, surrounded by the heavenly hosts, in a scene that made Samaria's luxury look like ash and dust before the Almighty's incandescent glory. The prophet revealed how a spirit had stepped forward to be a lie in the mouths of all Ahab's prophets, proving that when a man refuses to love the truth, he receives as punishment the freedom to believe in his own destruction. Christian psychology identifies here the peak of spiritual blindness, the moment when manipulation ceases to be external and becomes a permitted judgment, where the manipulated runs toward the abyss, thinking they are climbing the steps of a throne. The cold sweat running down Ahab's face as he heard Micaiah's account was the sign that his conscience, though seared, still recognized the sound of divine thunder. But pride and Jezebel's frigid influence prevented him from backing down. Zedekiah's blow to Micaiah's face was the physical response of wounded manipulation, a desperate attempt to reassert brute force where moral authority had already expired. Ahab, instead of prostrating himself, chose hardness of heart, ordering that the true prophet be fed with the bread of affliction until he, the king, returned in peace. A peace Micaiah knew was impossible. The science of manipulation operates on the denial of reality until the last second, trying to control the future by punishing the one who correctly predicted it. As Micaiah was dragged back to the dungeons, Ahab's fate was sealed not by a Syrian sword, but by his own decision to prefer the comfort of a royal lie over the discomfort of a prophetic truth. The danger of ignoring the final warning is that the door of mercy closes without a sound, leaving only the noise of horses preparing for a battle already lost in the invisible world. Ahab believed he could trick death itself by swapping his royal robes for the armor of a common soldier, trying to hide in the crowd while pushing Jehoshaphat, dressed in royal regalia, into the center of the target. The manipulator's psychology always seeks a human shield, someone to take the blows while they watch from a safe distance, camouflaged by the mediocrity they chose. He did not realize that in the eyes of eternal justice, a king without a crown remains the defendant, and no metal forged by human hands can block the verdict already signed in the celestial courts. As Syrian chariots frantically sought the king of Israel, focusing their spears on the solitary figure of Jehoshaphat, Ahab felt a false security, the bitter relief of one who believes they have outsmarted God through a costume trick. However, the science of manipulation fails miserably when confronted with the sovereignty that governs chance. For what we call coincidence is merely the invisible arm of truth, reaching those who tried to flee through the shortcuts of lies. In the midst of the battle's chaos, where the smell of sweat and blood saturated the air, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, without a specific target, firing an arrow that cut the wind with a trajectory defying human odds. The bronze tip did not seek Jehoshaphat's shiny armor. It found the exact gap between the joints of Ahab's protection, penetrating deep into the flesh he had tried so hard to preserve. The why of this shot was not in the archer's aim, but in the precision of a sentence that allows no errors. The arrow carried Naboth's name and Elijah's seal. The king, hit at the point where his vulnerability was exposed, felt the heat of blood flood his lungs, realizing at the last moment that his disguise had been merely a smokescreen that failed to hide his soul from the Creator's fiery gaze. The danger of hiding behind others is that when the blow finally lands, you are alone in your agony, surrounded by a crowd that does not know your true face. Ahab ordered his chariot to be withdrawn from the fight, but the flow of battle kept him trapped in a sea of iron and screams until the daylight began to fade behind the hills of Samaria. He remained standing in his chariot, propped up by a pride that refused to fall. While his blood washed the wooden floor and mingled with the dust of the road, he had traveled so much in search of power. The image of a king bleeding in silence inside a chariot is the ultimate representation of manipulation's failure. He possessed the land, the palace, and Jezebel's influence, but now he possessed not even the breath to cry for mercy. By nightfall, when life finally drained from his eyes, the body of the man who allowed silence to destroy his house was taken back to be washed in the pool of Samaria, exactly as the prophetic words had drawn. Ahab's final scene did not occur in a glorious funeral, but at the edge of a reservoir where prostitutes washed and where city dogs approached to lick the blood dripping from the royal chariot's wheels. Every lick was an echo of the judgment Jezebel believed she had avoided with her sealed letters and false prophets. The biological reality of a king's death became the food of impure animals, proving that the end of those who sell themselves to evil is devoid of any dignity. The science of manipulation promised Ahab a garden, but delivered a gutter, revealing that Jezebel's project was not to protect him, but to use him until he was nothing more than a useless carcass for her plans. Naboth's inheritance remained in the land, but Ahab's lineage began to be erased from history, a visceral reminder that the soil that accepts the blood of the righteous does not rest until the scales are balanced. The mystery remaining in the stones of Samaria is how someone could have had so much in their hands and chosen to end as a battlefield scrap, forgotten by everyone except the justice they tried to ignore. News of Ahab's death climbed the ivory steps of the palace, like a cold wind extinguishing the torches along the way. But Jezebel did not receive the mourning with ashes or tears. She received it with the calculating silence of one already redrawing the lines of power for the next move. The Phoenician queen watched her husband's empty chariot being washed, not as a widow in mourning, but as a strategist, seeing her main piece removed from the board, leaving behind a vacuum of authority she never planned to return. The psychology of narcissistic control does not allow the vulnerability of goodbye, for the manipulator sees people only as extensions of their own will. Without Ahab, she did not see the loss of a love, but the urgent need to convert her sons into new hosts for her spirit of domination. The palace, once vibrant with the king's presence, became a luxury mausoleum where Jezebel's voice now echoed with unfiltered authority, proving that the project of manipulation outlives its agents, as long as the structure of fear and idolatry remains standing. The corridors of Samaria, once full of whispers about Naboth's vineyard, now fell silent before the frigid presence of a woman who refused to bow her knees before the evidence of divine judgment. Jezebel began to mold the mind of her son Ahaziah, distilling into his ear the same poison of rebellion that had paralyzed his father's heart, ensuring the lineage of iniquity continued to flow through the nation's veins. The science of manipulation teaches that the system's survival depends on destroying the identity of the next generation, turning heirs into puppets who carry the weight of crimes they did not commit but accept as inheritance. The danger of a house governed by this spirit is that mourning is never a healing process, but a power transition where darkness grows denser with each succession, creating a dynasty of shadows feeding on the silence and passivity of those still breathing under that roof. The mystery of this period lies not in Israel's military strength, but in the resistance of a single will defying the heavens while the ground beneath her feet already began to crack under the weight of Elijah's sentence. Ahaziah ascended the throne carrying his father's name, but the spirit guiding his steps was his mother's, turning his reign into a tragic repetition of the errors that brought Ahab's blood to the pool of Samaria. The young king did not seek the Creator's face when in difficulty. Instead, he sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, proving that Jezebel's manipulation had eradicated any trace of spiritual fear in her offspring. The psychology of the Jezebel spirit is hereditary in terms of influence. It teaches children to seek solutions in corrupted sources, fleeing the truth that confronts to embrace the mysticism that comforts the ego. When the king fell through the lattice of his upper chamber, the physical impact was merely a reflection of a spiritual fall that had occurred much earlier, the moment he allowed his mother's hands to weave his soul's destiny. The accident was not bad luck, but the biological continuity of a judgment that does not rest as long as there are those feeding the altar of manipulation. Elijah, the prophet Ahab so hated, reappeared on the road of Ahaziah's life as a relentless reminder that truth does not die with the king who tried to silence it. The message was the same. Is it because there is no God in Israel? The science of manipulation tries to create a world where God is irrelevant or a protocol detail, but the reality of death and disease tears that veil with a violence no foreign ritual can contain. Ahaziah died in his ivory bed, without seeing the glory his mother promised him, leaving the throne to his brother Joram in a succession marked by the smell of pagan incense and the chill of hopelessness. The danger of following Jezebel's project is that it is a path of dead ends, where every door closing behind you is locked by the pride of those refusing to admit the Phoenician strategy is a spiritual suicide pact. The dynasty was bleeding, but Jezebel remained atop her windows, painting her eyes and preparing her face for a final confrontation she believed she could win with her own malice's magnetism. The sound of horses galloping furiously through the plains of Jezreel was not just the noise of a military revolt, but the thunder of a divine response waiting for the exact moment to dismantle the empire of manipulation. Jehu, the captain whose chariot driving was known for madness and impetus, brought with him the anointing of a judgment that accepted no bribe or diplomacy, acting as the necessary scalpel to remove the cancer Jezebel had installed in Israel's heart. Christian psychology warns us that there are moments when God's patience gives way to the need to protect the innocent, and Jehu was the blunt instrument of this transition, a man with no patience for the layers of seduction protecting Samaria's throne. He did not come to talk or negotiate peace terms. He came to execute the sentence pronounced years before under Elijah's stern gaze, proving that the time of tolerance for the manipulation system has an insurmountable limit. Joram, the last king of Ahab's direct line, went out to meet Jehu in the field that had belonged to Naboth, a geographic detail the Bible highlights to show that justice always returns to the crime scene to close the cycle. "Is it peace, Jehu?" asked the king, still operating under the illusion that court language could calm the fire of retribution. Jehu's response was a blow to the system's soul. "What peace so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" In that instant, the science of manipulation was unmasked as a web of spiritual deceptions that no longer possessed the power to protect its own children. Jehu's arrow pierced Joram's heart, and the king's body was thrown into the land his father stole, turning the soil of greed into a royal carcass dump. The danger of inheriting manipulation's gains is that you also inherit its creditors, and the payment demanded by Naboth's field was the total extinction of those who fed on its stolen fruits. As Jehu's army advanced like an open wound across the land of Jezreel, Jezebel did not seek the refuge of the dungeons or the protection of her stone gods. She climbed to the highest point of her tower, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the distant echo of her son's death. Her fingers, once adorned with Ahab's seal, now dipped into jars of antimony, painting around her eyes a war mask that the world mistakes for vanity, but which the science of manipulation recognizes as the final effort of a will refusing to be broken. She adorned her head with the jewels of Phoenicia, feeling the weight of gold against skin already beginning to wither, transforming her face into an icon of immutable power, while her kingdom's soil was washed by the blood of her lineage. The psychology of spiritual narcissism reveals that for the manipulator, image is the only reality left when the control structure collapses, and Jezebel preferred to die as a feared queen than to beg as a defeated mother. She positioned herself at the window, not to observe the landscape, but to dominate the sight of those arriving, using her artificial beauty as a last attempt to paralyze the executioner with her malignant presence's magnetism. The silence emanating from the high window was more disturbing than the battle's shouts, for it carried the confidence of one who believes the glint of painted eyes can divert an arrow's trajectory or a revolt's impetus. Hearing the sound of Jehu's hooves against the pavement, she did not tremble. She leaned out, exposing herself like a fallen deity, still expecting worship, and her voice cut the air with an irony seeking to wound the captain's soul. "Had Zimri peace who slew his master?" she cried, trying to use history as a weapon to label Jehu as a simple traitor rather than an arm of divine justice. This is the final why of her strategy, the attempt to invert roles, making the judge feel like a criminal through a psychological mirroring she had practiced for decades with Ahab. However, the gritty realism of Jezreel no longer allowed the palace's hall of mirrors, and the dust rising from Jehu's chariot wheels was the sign that the time for seductive words had been buried alongside Joram's body in Naboth's vineyard. Jehu looked up at the window, but his eyes were not captured by Jezebel's painting. They sought the silent accomplices inhabiting the shadows behind the queen, the men who had been castrated in their dignity to serve a foreign will's whims. "Who is on my side, who?" shouted the captain, and the weight of that question tore the veil of feigned loyalty holding the palace structure together, forcing a choice that admitted no neutrality. 2 or 3 eunuchs, men whose lives had been consumed by fear and service to that manipulation, appeared beside Jezebel, and in their eyes was no longer the submission of old, but the despair of those wishing to free themselves from a yoke that had become too heavy. The psychology of liberation shows us that a manipulator's collapse rarely comes from outside. It begins when those supporting their throne decide the fear of judgment is greater than the fear of retaliation. Without a word of defense, the same arms that previously served her now pushed her, and the queen's body, laden with silk and arrogance, was cast into the void, cutting the air in a fall symbolizing the final end of the science of manipulation in Israel. Jezebel's impact against the stone was not the sound of a royal fall, but the sound of a statue shattering. A dry thud that sent blood splashing against the walls and over Jehu's horses, staining Jezreel's luxury with biological reality's rawness. Jehu did not turn away. He drove his chariot over the body of the one who once made kings tremble, feeling the jolt of the wheels over ivory bones, transforming painted beauty into a trail of flesh and dust. The science of manipulation ends where gritty realism begins, on the ground where power has no voice and seduction finds no ears, leaving only the silence of a judgment that cannot be avoided. As Jehu entered the palace to eat and drink, the body of the one who controlled a nation was left behind, proving the world she built with lies was unable to offer her even a dignified grave. The danger of becoming a god in your own house is that when you fall, no one dares pick up the pieces, leaving your memory at the mercy of the elements and the hunger of those who know no royal etiquette. After satisfying his hunger, Jehu ordered Jezebel's burial, moved by a remnant of respect for the royal lineage she came from. But arriving at the fall's site, the servants found a scene defying human understanding and confirming the precision of Elijah's prophecy. Of the woman who ruled through Ahab's silence and Naboth's blood, only the skull, feet and palms remained, as if the earth itself refused to absorb the rest of her corrupt essence. The dogs of Jezreel, masterless animals wandering the city's cracks, had devoured the queen's body, fulfilling the biological sentence that what was gained by plunder would be returned to nature in the most degrading way possible. Christian psychology identifies here the total erasure of manipulative identity. She left no monument, no body to be mourned, becoming dung on the field's face, exactly as the prophet predicted. The why of such absolute destruction lies in the need to purify the national memory's soil, ensuring no shrine was built in the name of one who turned manipulation into a form of worship. Jezebel's disappearance was not a tragedy, but a systemic cleansing revealing the fragility of any power not sustained by justice and truth. Those hands, which wrote Naboth's condemnation letters and painted themselves to seduce judgment, now were nothing but bone fragments in the dust, devoid of any magnetism or authority. The science of manipulation prides itself on longevity, but Samaria's history teaches us its end is sudden and its heritage is vacuum, leaving only the warning that the Creator is not mocked by paintings or royal seals. The silence falling over Jezreel after the dog's banquet was a different silence from Ahab's. It was the silence of peace restored through reckoning, a new breath for a land that spent decades suffocated by spiritual control. We are invited to look at these remains not with hatred, but with the fear of one understanding that every choice of manipulation distances us from our humanity until nothing remains of us but fragments that time will see fit to forget. Jezebel's end did not stop the body count, for the science of manipulation leaves deep roots that continue draining a nation's life even after its main architects fall. Ahab's 70 sons, living under tutors' care in Samaria, became the last vestige of a dynasty that flourished in ivory and oppression, but now found itself isolated in a palace smelling of betrayal and fear. Jehu, operating with the coldness of one cutting off a gangrenous limb, sent letters to the city leaders, challenging them to choose the best among the heirs to fight for a throne already claimed by Naboth's blood. The fear psychology, planted by Jezebel over decades, reaped its final harvest when the elders, terrified by the royal fall's speed, decided survival was more valuable than loyalty to a condemned lineage. They did not raise swords to defend the king's sons. Instead, they delivered the prince's heads in baskets, proving power built on manipulation is a house of cards collapsing at the first breath of real, raw authority. The silence following those baskets' delivery at Jezreel's gates was the final echo of Ahab's omission, a vacuum swallowing his house's future because he refused to be the truth's guardian in the present. Observing the heirs' heads piled at the city entrance, the people of Israel witnessed the complete anatomy of what happens when female narcissism and male cowardice fuse to rule a home. Each lifeless face was a page torn from a book Ahab tried to write, with blood ink and lie seals, revealing that the protection offered by Jezebel was actually a long-term death sentence for all she claimed to love. The science of manipulation is a thief of generations. It is not content with destroying the present. It needs to consume tomorrow, turning a family's heritage into a pile of bones and regrets that time cannot erase. Jehu walked among that fallen glory's remains, his armor still dirty with Jezreel's mud, serving as the involuntary narrator of a story no king would wish to star in. The why of such violence lay not in the executioner's character, but in the sin's density saturating Samaria's soil, demanding a purification allowing no leftovers or diplomatic concessions. The danger of allowing a Jezebel to rule your table is that she will turn your children into shields and eventually into sacrifices for an agenda that was never about family, but about her own insatiable ego's perpetuation. The ivory palace's ruins may be buried under time's sands, but the manipulation blueprint Jezebel perfected continues being replicated in modern homes, where many men's silence still opens the way for entire families' destruction. The pattern is identical, identifying emotional weakness, using guilt as a leash, triangulation to isolate victims, and creating a parallel reality where the manipulator is always the hero or the wronged martyr. Christian psychology warns us this spirit has no gender, but found its most refined expression in Jezebel, using seduction and spiritual control to divert the purpose of those meant to lead with righteousness. Today, she is in your house not as a Phoenician queen, but as a behavioral pattern whispering that the end justifies the means and control is the only form of security. If you feel your voice was stolen, your heritage is being sold in pieces, or silence has become your only survival strategy, you are living under Jezreel's shadow, and the cost of this passivity is the same Ahab paid, the loss of all that is sacred. The story of 1 Kings 21 and Jezebel's fall does not end with death, but with an urgent call for Ahab's spirit to be cast out from the soul of whoever wishes to protect their house and lineage. Breaking the manipulation cycle requires more than lamentations. It requires Naboth's courage to say no to the invasion of what is sacred, even if the price is direct confrontation with darkness disguised as comfort. The science of manipulation loses its power when the truth's light is lit, and complicit silence is replaced by the sound of a prayer reclaiming the authority delegated by the Creator. Your house does not belong to Jezebel's project, and your life is not a script written by another's narcissism. You are the guardian of a spiritual vineyard bought with blood far more precious than Naboth's. Closing this spiritual autopsy, look into your own reality's dark corners and decide manipulation's seal will no longer have power over your name, for God's justice is the only foundation able to sustain a house against eternity's storms. The final mystery is that freedom begins the moment you stop turning your face to the wall and decide to face the truth that will set you free forever from the destruction project that tried to install itself in your home. If this journey through the shadows of Samaria has brought clarity to your vision and awakened in you the desire to protect your spiritual heritage, do not leave here without sealing this learning. Like this video as an act of resistance against manipulation and subscribe to the Bible Teachers channel so we can continue unearthing the truths the world tries to hide. Share this documentary with someone who needs to wake up from Ahab's silence or free themselves from Jezebel's chains. Remember, truth does not only confront, it sets free. We'll see you in the next study, where the Bible continues to teach what time cannot erase. May God's justice guard your house.